Hello and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Kelly and I'm going to be your host for today's presentation. How can an agile supply chain help with our digital S/4HANA journey? And with each of our webinars, we're going to invite you to examine your own supply chain and inspire you to use the powerful capabilities already built inside of SAP. And today's presentation is going to last approximately 30 to 45 minutes. Followed by a time to ask questions at the end. So please feel free to capture your questions in the question or chat section during the webinar. And at this point, I'd like to introduce you to Martin Rowan, today's speaker. Martin's passion is to help companies leverage their current technology investment to optimize their integrated extended supply chains to achieve a world-class status. His 20+ years of experience covers a wide variety of industries across multiple countries with specific focus on driving transformational change within the organization and their core value chain. Martin speaks frequently at conferences around the world, typically on topics around the importance of optimizing supply chains. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you, Martin. How are you today?
Good morning, Kelly. I'm well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Always chuckle and smile when I hear this beautiful biography of my life. It seems less exciting than when you say it, but thank you. Yeah, so today's webinar is kind of a wrap-up of the year, and we had a 5-series webinar this year, and it was well attended, and I received a tremendous amount of feedback in terms of the excitement around what companies are able to do with their SAP investment. And if you recall, I started the series talking a bit about how do we see SAP as an asset and how do we turn our supply chains into agile supply chains. And that was kind of still early part of the year. Obviously, a lot has happened in the last 2 years with COVID-19. And so really the question at hand right now that we're getting from a lot of organizations is, okay, so we've adapted to this new quote unquote normal, right? But going forward, life's not going to be the same. And we're hearing from our clients and our audiences, what is going to be different? How are we going to be different? What does it actually look like for us to go forward as SAP changes as well? Now, we've all heard about the supply chain disruptions and challenges. We all know about the shortage of labor and trucking and all the elements that cause disruptions. But a lot of the questions that we're hearing are things like, so what's really going to be different for me as a user with S/4HANA? How does it actually affect my job now that I have to deal with so many more disruptions and challenges? Is it going to make my life easier? What's different about this journey? Have we started? Have we not started it? Are there other ways to handle it? And frankly, can S4 help us? And so I think as we wrap up this series this year, I'm going to touch on some of these things, but more importantly, and we'll talk a bit about it later, is we're going to really try to use some of these questions as an input into our webinar series for next year, for sure. So the agenda for today is kind of a 3-level topic highlight reel around why an agile supply chain is important. And I've touched on this and my colleagues have touched on this, but I want to summarize it for us one last time to help us understand the importance of being agile. And then, of course, we want to understand how S/4HANA plays into that and how an agile supply chain can actually help us with our S/4HANA journey. And then lastly, I want to kind of summarize maybe from a business perspective, what are the options that we have from an S/4HANA journey point of view? Because at the end of the day, we all know that there's a bogey out there. SAP has set the target for 2027. They've already moved it once from 2025 to 2027. There may be one more time of move, but we don't know. But ultimately, that's kind of the technical goal out there. But the question always at hand is, what does it really mean for us as a business? Does it actually going to make life easier? Is it going to help our supply chains? And is it going to help our supply chains be more agile as well? So let's start with the first one. And I think this is important, again, just to set context. And when you think of pre-pandemic, very interesting statistic that existed pre-pandemic was that 44% of supply chain leaders did not believe that the executive management saw supply chain as a strategic imperative. They saw it more as a cost center to service the business. And more than 60% of supply chain organizations actually used it as a cost efficiency driver rather than necessarily as a value stream that has to be resilient and agile. So you can imagine, so for us as supply chain professionals, we know that's not true and we lived it. But unfortunately, that was the understanding of what the supply chain truly is for the organization pre-pandemic. Obviously, since the pandemic and COVID-19 arriving, and it's a good 18 plus months now, I think even grandma knows that that's not true anymore, right? When we run out of toilet paper, we run out of paper towels, or we run out of computer chips that now drive cars, and everything else is backed up. There's obviously a real importance around supply chains, and it's becoming far more value driven and understood within the organization going forward. So what we really realize is that at the end of the day, our supply chains are actually incredibly vulnerable. We saw that over and over again throughout this time, is that as an organization, we are so dependent on so many interactions of all these little pieces to come together that when we don't actually drive that resilience or integration into the supply chain, we lose a lot of that strength that we expect. We also understood that not only are we having issues with our micro supply chains, our own organizational supply chains, but within the larger macro supply chain across the globe, it's been stretched and strained to the max. And still, to date, we're seeing some of that. We've also come to realize that depending on which side of the lucky coin you fall, whether you have too much demand or too little demand, we have found that at the end of the day, inventory is still at the heart of all of those challenges. We either have too little and we can't service our clients, or we have too much and we bought too much because we thought we needed it and we don't. And so trying to be able to manage that is going to become definitely a bigger discussion in the future of supply chains. And then lastly, this is kind of the question I posed in my first webinar in the beginning of the year was, we need to understand what a good supply chain looks like and then what great supply chains look like, and start moving towards great supply chains. Now, let's also be clear that COVID-19 was a huge disruption, but it wasn't the only disruption that happened throughout the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, we'd had everything from trade wars to Brexit, natural disasters, massive protests all around the world. So at the end of the day, COVID-19 was a big part, but this is in reality something that exists around the world all the time. However, it's interesting that I think this year in particular, in the last year or two, 2/3 of CEOs have actually come back and said they're going to use this disruption as an opportunity for redesigning their business. Now, when you start thinking about redesigning your business, you can't redesign your business without redesigning your supply chain and your value chain, if that is at the core of your business. And then interestingly enough, according to Gartner, basically the #1 area CEOs want supply chains to focus is optimizing the supply chain operations, which is fabulous news, because finally I think the microscope is now placed on something that we all strongly believe in and need to be focusing on. But let me tell you a quick story, because it's really important to understand that disruptions isn't new, and it's not something that's going to go away. If anything, it's happening is accelerating, and we're seeing it at larger levels. But a great little story is Kodak, right? Kodak started in the 1800s. It's over 100 years old, and was incredible in being able to establish a market and dominated a market around photography. But they filed for bankruptcy in 2012. And when you start peeling back the onion, people typically think that it's because of the digital era and digital cameras, and therefore Kodak was unable to actually keep up. Actually, as an actual matter of fact, that's not true at all. So Kodak had already identified and designed and prototyped the first digital camera in 1975. So they were way ahead of the curve. And then by the 1990s, they were the predominant digital camera manufacturer. So they had absolutely no struggles keeping up with the times. The problem is that they were so focused on their film-based supply chain that they missed what was really important and where the market was changing. They even purchased organizations that allowed them to take the digital pictures and print them because they had such a big belief that people still wanted a photo in their hand, and their whole supply chain was built around that they spent all their money trying to produce and create opportunities around taking these digital photos and pushing it into their supply chain, which was the predominant part of their business, their film-based supply chain. What they didn't realize is that actually, what ultimately killed them was the fact that it wasn't about the photo per se, it was about photo sharing. And within 3 years of Facebook starting to share photos, it was basically the death knell for Kodak as it relates to the business itself. So disruptions are not new, and they haven't gone away, and they won't go away. So it's important for us to be able to adjust to that. Now, when you start looking at closer to home, when we start looking at specific organizations, what we found and what we continue to see is how, and these are just basic SAP screens, is you can see how certain components are having a bigger impact within the network of the supply chain. And when those are delayed through supplier performance or suppliers going out of business or trucking delays, it has an impact on production. Production has a challenge to then be able to commit to customer needs. And ultimately, what we end up finding is just, as you look at a bill of material on the bottom right-hand corner, just riddled with a whole bunch of exceptions saying, I am late, I am unable to meet those needs. And so the disruption that one little piece can cause throughout the entire supply chain becomes so apparent. And this was the story of the last 2 years. I don't believe there was an organization we got involved in that we did not see this kind of ripple effect throughout their business based on all of those disruptions. So then the question is, so how do we deal with that? How do we handle disruptions, and how do we actually react in a way that allows our organization to benefit from these changes? This is where the question of good versus great comes in, right? And this is, again, part of my first discussion at the webinar in the beginning of the year, but everybody's talking about resilient supply chain. How do we build more resilience into the supply chain? Now, resilience is an interesting term because by definition, it really talks about how a substance or an object springs back to where they were. So think of it almost like a palm tree bending, and our supply chain was bent, and then when we have a resilient one, it bounces back to where we were. The problem with that is it takes a lot of time. It typically just goes back to the same place where it was, and usually because resilience often needs a lot of redundancy, it's very expensive and creates a lot of energy. But who wants to go back to where we were? That's the challenge, is moving to a great supply chain. A great supply chain refers to our ability to understand and quickly adjust to the circumstances that we are faced with, and that's called agility. These are small, quick adjustments, course corrections that typically don't cost a lot. We allow ourselves to fail fast, but also we're able to succeed fast. And through this agility, we're able to steer the ship, correct the ship, and move it in the right direction in smaller increments, and actually come out the other side with an even more resilient and stronger supply chain than just a supply chain that bounces back to where we were. And since we know that the new normal isn't going to change and the future doesn't look the same as the past, we know that we're going to have to be able to look differently at our supply chains, and agility is going to be at the core of it. So for us as an organization, we need to think about becoming more agile. And interesting enough, when looked into this by Gartner, they actually were able to investigated a tremendous amount of companies and researched and found that those companies that typically did not have that agility and visibility in their organization were the ones that followed the blue graph. They would have the disruption would happen, and it will take them a long time to react and build it up, because typically is the way to those organizations reacted is that they needed to change, then they set task force in place, they built new spreadsheets, and they started reevaluating everything. And then finally, when they decided what the risk analysis was, they were able to react to it and ultimately come out the other side. That is resiliency at its best, right? A lot of work to kind of get us back. Agility is following the orange curve, where organizations did had an impact, but they were able to react incredibly fast, proactively, because of the visibility of information, because they were able to understand, they were able to make small and minor increments, and was able to bounce back incredibly fast in comparison to all the other organizations. So agility is not a future state need anymore. It is actually now table stakes for us as organizations to truly be able to thrive in the new world as we go forward. And so what that means is, as an organization, how are we supposed to be more agile when it relates to SAP? Well, quite simply this, right? If we want to be able to react fast to circumstances, we need to be able to manage the rules to manage our business. We don't want to recreate processes. We don't want to be able to create big spreadsheets and send out memos. We want to be able to make those micro adjustments to be able to see the business change. And so when we do see something is being held up, we can proactively, through exceptions, see how it's going to impact the network on the left-hand side, and ultimately then forces us and helps us say, okay, we need to adjust the rules. What are those policies we can adjust? So we can start seeing our supply chains move more towards the bottom right-hand side of it, where we can see how we collapse our supply chain reaction to smaller cycles and quicker cycles or shorter turnarounds. And so that's agility, because now when something changes, we can react pretty quickly to that. Now, it's important to understand this, because a good example of this is an organization up here on the north side of Chicago went through an exercise to become more rule oriented and become more agile as a supply chain pre-COVID, a couple of years actually prior to COVID. When COVID actually then hit, they realized that their cleaning equipment was less desired at the time, but their cleaning chemicals went through the roof, as we can all imagine why. Within 4 weeks, they were able to go into the system, make the adjusted changes needed in SAP, and to reprioritize their supply chains and their production facilities, and were able to meet the needs of the chemical sales and allocations versus the equipment side of it within 4 weeks, where most companies took months to make those adjustments to start seeing some benefit in the changes that happened to them, whether it was a demand increase or a demand decrease. So how do we know if we're an agile organization? Now, for those of you who know Reveal, have seen this maturity continuum many times. This is actually just the new colors of it, but it hasn't changed. The context hasn't changed. It's basically a 5-level maturity discussion. And when you're kind of in the 4 to 5 range, you're an agile organization. You have the ability to set targets, optimize, set targets, and optimize that create that continuous improvement that I mentioned earlier, being able to meet those needs. If, of course, we're in the 1, 2, and 3 range, our ability to actually be agile is stifled significantly. And one way to measure that pretty easily is to take a real honest look at yourself and say, how well are we using SAP's integrated capabilities, planning capabilities, trust the data, and manage the rules? And if we're in the 5 to 15% range, we're probably on the low end of this maturity continuum. And you can see as you go forward, very few organizations that have moved into the optimization agile have typically go beyond the 50%, 45 to 50% range in the use of SAP. When you're in that range, 75% range, you have been able to turn SAP into an asset that can actually help drive your business value and become that agile supply chain. So this is a good way for you to establish a quick, honest check on yourself. Now, also, you'll notice there's a link at the bottom of the actual screen. It's a new self-assessment that we've released recently. It's really, really powerful, and it gives you a really beautiful report that you can share with your organization. So in case you are wanting to start having this conversation with the internal folks and your peers, it's a great way to do that. Okay, so agility isn't anymore just important, it is actually table stakes for us to be a value growing, scalable organization. So then the question is how can this agile supply chain help with our S/4HANA journey? And to what extent can S/4HANA help us with being an agile supply chain? Now, we all have seen illustrations and versions of this. We know SAP's changed their database structure. We know they're changing their processes. We know that they're changing their GUI and the way that it's working with Fiori. And they are truly moving in that digital space, and very visionary in the sense that they started this way before the whole COVID thing happened. But the question really at the hand right now is, how does S/4HANA actually help us being more agile? Now, if you start looking at your supply chain and the people, whether it's production planners, supply chain planners, procurement, accounting, who you name it, in there, we still see the same symptoms we've seen in the past. Why am I having to expedite raw materials all the time? Maybe there's a physical challenge based on shipping requirements, but then there's also well, why am I changing my schedules all the time? Why is my demand not allocated to the right dates? Why have I not been able to commit to my customers through available to promise? Where did all this inventory go? Did we ship it? Did we not? Which spreadsheet do I need to review today? How do I figure it out? So all of these things have still existed. So the answer to the earlier question is can S/4HANA help us be more agile? The answer is yes and no at the same time. So let's explore that further. Yes, in the ability for us to have technology that can help drive benefits, but no, because we do not address the fundamental premise that every organization is challenged with every single day. And that is that we do a really poor job in educating our folks on what and how to use SAP to drive the business forward. Some of the statistics you just threw up in there, 25% of business productivity is lost due to poor system adoption. Poor system adoption comes about because people don't know what they don't know, right? And that is fundamentally premised on this notion that we train people to create transactions. We never educate them on how to run their process, their business, and how to react proactively to it. How can I use SAP data to create insights, that insights help me create action and proactive action for that matter? So at the heart of it is the old adage of I don't know what I don't know. And that doesn't change when we implement S/4HANA. And let's use a really practical example. Let's use MRP. Everybody knows MRP. Most people use MRP. And S/4HANA has brought significant enhancements to MRP. Back in the day, it was a very sequential series of actions that would happen. You know, it would read the planning file, and then it would create certain transactions, and it would then validate certain, and it would go sequentially through each one and create a result for us. With MRP in S/4HANA and using the HANA database, things are running in parallel. So this parallelization is creating capabilities to be able to look at multiple plants at the same time across the network and be able to produce material shortages in real time through MRP Live. So unbelievable enhanced features from an SAP S/4HANA perspective. And so at the heart of it, if you think of it, it can allow us to be incredibly agile, right? Because it's taking data, it's turning it into insights. We can take that insights, apply the intelligence to it, and then actually drive actions. And if you look at these screenshots, here's a perfect example of how MRP is producing a list of things that need attention. When clicked on, it's also producing a set of recommendations on the right-hand side. And in addition to that, it's actually rating which recommendation you should pick based on a set of priorities or criteria that you can define in SAP. So in this particular case, we need a windshield universal mount. It's going to be short in around 14th of June and going to continue to remain short throughout the next few weeks. So what can we do? We can either increase our production, we can change our production, we can reschedule things, or we can go and procure it externally. And it's rating that for us. Incredibly powerful from an agility perspective. But let's come back to my earlier question around the understanding part. Do we actually understand how MRP is working, how it's functioning, what data point inputs is it using to create these results? What actually am I adjusting? What are the rules or the master data that actually is telling the system how to react and respond to this? And if I don't trust these recommendations, frankly, the agility goes out the window, because I'm going to most likely defer back to a spreadsheet of mine and trust that because I built it and I know what the data is in there. So at the heart of it, the yes-no answer is true. The system can provide agility for us, but us as an organization need to have the mind shift and the understanding on how to apply it and use it and actually create the right data sets for it. So from an S/4HANA perspective, the question always is who's the elephant in the room? Or in this case, the pig, and you'll see why I say that. If we have a whole bunch of manual intervention and mistrust in data, unpredictability, and a whole bunch of siloed organizational functions and characteristics, which creates just a tremendous amount of noise in the business. When we slap SAP S/4HANA on top of it, why do we think that things are going to change? All that's going to happen is we're going to have the same outputs, same symptoms on the other side. If anything, more accelerated chaos than actually what we even had. And so the elephant/pig in the room is why do we think lipstick on a pig is going to change things? It won't. And we need to dig into the reasons why. So I've got a few practical take-homes for you that we can work through now and specifically discuss what are some of the options you can start thinking about as you move into S/4HANA, or even if you've moved into S/4HANA already and need to make some adjustments. Step number one, it is imperative for you to truly and honestly review where you are on the maturity continuum. If you don't understand kind of organizationally, I'm not talking about specific functions, because procurement may be in a 3 and accounting may be in a 1 and production may be in a 0 if there was a 0, right? But as an organization, where do you stand? And then concertedly put a plan in place that moves you from wherever you are, a 1.3, a 2.4, or a 3.1, into the 4 and 5 range in a very proactive way. And again, if you're unable to do this subjectively just by looking at this chart and reading the bullet points, I really highly recommend you go click on that self-assessment opportunity on the website and go and do that. And like I said, it creates a very descriptive report for you that allows you to set yourself on this continuum and start having a peer-to-peer conversation around what to do to move forward. Understanding also that it takes a lot of effort to optimize your organization out of levels 1, 2, and 3, and then move yourself into level 4 and 5. And there's a good argument to be made that you should probably not move to S/4HANA until you're outside of the 3 range and starting to play in the level 4 maturity range, because that's where we find agility at the end of the day. Okay, one of the second things to really consider, and that is flipping the script. We've been in this business for 20 plus years, and if there's one thing that hasn't changed, and that is that every organization believes they're unique, every person believes they're a snowflake, and therefore I need to change the system to look the way I need it to look for the report that I need, or how our organization run. We have done it this way for 100 years. Now we have to do it this way going forward, or we have to change the system. And as with Kodak, different disruption, we have to understand that we have to flip the script. We have to understand that we have to think of SAP as a way of doing business. Why redesign a process that works and that can function across your entire organization? There is no more competitive advantage in how you actually create a purchase order. The competitive advantage comes in is how you react to when that purchase order is late and how you're able to meet your customer services needs and able to be innovative in your product delivery and offering. The third thing is for us to start moving away from the eternal anchor for most organizations, that is spreadsheets and custom tables, rogue solutions if you want, right? For every workaround that we create, we break the integration of SAP. And every time we break the integration of SAP, SAP actually is unable to function the way it's supposed to. It's blind to data points being connected and creating an integration. And therefore, any exception or alert that it can offer you for proactive changes is either false, a false alert or a false notification, or frankly, just irrelevant because of the breakdown in integration. So we need to bring all of those workarounds back into the system, which aligns back to point number 2, and create a single source of truth within SAP and not believe we're that unique. The fourth activity is that we need to understand that supply chains would be perfect if it wasn't for people. I know that's not 100% true. That's more my sense of humor. But everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. And so when we think of supply chains and we think of how we come together as a system, we need to address the fundamental human behavior side of things. We need to understand that people fall into a rut and they do certain things for a certain way based on how they were trained, what they learned from Sally or the previous boss or whomever, and they create a rut or a habit. Breaking that habit is the biggest challenge, and that change management component is not only needed now in your organization, but will for sure be needed when you go to S/4HANA, and definitely on the back end of the S/4HANA implementation. So ongoing encouragement to make sure that we really address the people side of things in creating healthy behaviors that can manage and deal with the change. It's no longer good enough to just be good at creating a bunch of transactions in SAP for record keeping purposes. It now requires a different level of professional role within the organization where you're able to think, critically apply, and adjust and use the technology and information to become more agile as in your specific world. Number 5 is to start using the technology, functionality, and capabilities that exist. On average, it's sad to say, on average, in our research with organizations, most companies that have run SAP, whether it's for 5 years or 20 years, rarely uses more than 35 to 40% of its capabilities. Mostly it's got to do with I don't know what I don't know, or I think I'm too unique, or I've got the spreadsheet that does it for me, and et cetera, right? But just using this simple example, this little screenshot here is SAP's production graphical planning board. And I cannot tell you how few people actually know it exists. 1, 2, how easy it is to use it. But most importantly, how the system actually cannot truly function if you're not using it. Because it's tracking and leveling capacities. It's allowing you to make adjustments if a production line goes down and maintenance needs to be done. It's allowing you your procurement and your raw materials to be staged appropriately. Warehouse and the stores are able to put the right products in place and combine your materials for you. And so it's not putting these things in place or running it in some kind of a spreadsheet is creating massive gaps and holes within the system. So let's start exploring, let's be curious, and let's start finding out what SAP can actually offer us. If we don't address those things now, don't be naive to think it's going to be better as soon as we go to S/4HANA. So here's that success story I mentioned earlier about the company up in the northern side of Chicago. They went through a situation when they realized that they needed to better utilize the system. And you can see in the first quarter of that graph, that's what happened. The initiative started to start learning how to use it. They started then optimizing their processes, their system, their data, their inventories, and you can see how the inventory started dropping and becoming more predictable. And finally, when they started maximizing the capabilities of the system, they were actually able to not only drop the inventory averages down and save a tremendous amount of inventory and cost and capital gains, but they were also able to weather the pandemic because of the small micro changes that they were able to make to be able to address those needs. Okay, so what does this mean for us as an organization, specifically around what options now do we have as when it comes to S/4HANA? Well, let's start off by just talking about the basic premise, right? So the basic premise that exists with implementing anything, whether it was R3, ECC, or now S/4HANA, is we go through a design process. And you know, they changed the term. It used to be an ASET methodology. Now it's an activate methodology, but it's kind of the same thing. We have some kind of a plan. We blueprint our processes. We configure and load the data into the system. We test it. We train people on it. But the predominant focus of any implementation is to get the system transactions to work. That's kind of the goal here. And we measure success by saying, hey, the system's live, it's up and running. The data has been migrated error-free. You know, the user security is in place. People have been trained how to create transactions. The design matches the business need, right? The solution documentation's in place. Users have now some basic support to go forward. And we immediately go into an hypercare scenario where that turns into more of a longer-term support or break fix scenario. And then hopefully we do some continuous improvement along the way. However, the typical challenges that organizations face with any implementation is that they don't really allow the business to own SAP. It remains kind of an IT tool. The business doesn't want to own it because they don't necessarily understand how to use it. So true education wasn't really applied to the point where people really understand the why and the what behind the transactions. The change management wasn't really done, like I alluded to earlier. We didn't really get people to buy into it other than saying, here's your new tool. By the way, here's your 5 steps. Here's your quick little cheat sheet. Go run and do your business. The process and the organization integration wasn't achieved. So we put in certain functions, but we didn't necessarily connect all the dots. So integration was broken, and we have these kind of silo solutions again. So all of these typical challenges exist. And what that really does for the organizations is that we have these elusive benefits that never really are achieved. So we don't have agility in our supply chain as we expected we would have. Our service levels start degrading, our working capital and cost starts growing, our throughput starts slowing down, or if we maintain it, we're doing it at a Herculean effort. We're able to, our decision making slows down because everybody now makes a decision off of their spreadsheet, not on a single source of truth. And we're not reacting to only the proactive change in need, but we're reacting to everything as an exception. So we firefight continuously. And so what does it mean for our organization? Our IT efforts never really reduce, they kind of remain high. Business efforts don't really improve either. We just, if anything, we start hiring more people, frankly, to deal with it. And lastly, and most importantly, our adoption and our buy-in into the system and the new way of doing things, just as much as the excitement exists early on, it wanes pretty quickly to the point where we just move further and further away from the system. And why would you expect it to be any different? Because change management at the heart of it follows this curve, this value of change curve that has existed since the 80s. And it's all about us going from this excitement that something's going to happen. However, we're unconsciously income. We don't know what we don't know. We go into this state of frustration because now we know what we don't know. Then we're supposed to really get it when we have this conscious competence. And then we move into success, we have this unconscious competence. Now we actually understand why, we understand what, and it becomes, it's second nature to us. However, if we're unable to break through to that yellow bubble at the top right-hand side, we tend to revert back. And there's that inflection point down at the bottom of that aha. Do we get it or do we not get it? And this is all premised around people's knowledge. And so if we take our previous illustration of how the user adoption happens and we overlay the value of change to it, you can see that where that red bubble is now is that we didn't accept it. We didn't accept the changes. We didn't really adopt the new ways. We tried to make the system look like the old one. All of those benefits were elusive. So we're really not much better off for it, frankly, at the end of the day. As much as S4HANA can bring us agility, if we don't address all of the other components I mentioned, we truly are unable to really benefit from that. So how do we flip the script? Well, there's a couple of options I'm going to raise with you in the next couple of slides. But at the heart of it is that we need to make sure people really understand what they're doing. They need to understand the business processes. They need to understand how SAP works and functions. They need to understand how the rules engines activate automation around MRP and planning strategies and demand and supply planning, network analysis. We need people to understand how all of these pieces fit together in a single source of truth to create this agility. When we get that going, we're able to go through that value of change and actually push all the way through to those winning ways and really adopt the system. Then we see that curve stay up in the top right-hand continuum quadrant as the buy-in and adoption just continues to grow. Because now we're in a state of continuous optimization. We're continuing to be agile, and all of those data responses like MRP Live is giving me actual information that I can react to proactively and rapidly. So what are our options? And I'll leave you with this. Option number one is if you have not implemented S4HANA yet, it is probably a good time to hit the pause button, think about your current environment, and think about how do I optimize that my current state into a state of automation, predictability, trusting the data, getting the organization to work integrated way, and set a blueprint up for me to move to an S4HANA state. Not only do I gain a tremendous amount of benefit out of that in actual quantifiable dollars, but I also create a blueprint for me to go to S4HANA, and the change that goes with it is actually significantly less. And in some cases, the benefit from doing this actually helps pay for the S4HANA move. So it becomes a self-funding scenario. If you find yourself on option number two, where you've actually implemented S4HANA already, whether it's a brand new greenfield implementation or something from a conversion, and you find yourself now in a state of continual manual intervention, some of the data is becoming less trustworthy, we don't have a lot of predictability yet, we're still kind of playing this whack-a-mole game, and our organization is still kind of living in their own little silos with their rogue systems and personal information systems, it's then time for you to start considering some kind of optimization effort to get yourself back to a level of agility so you can meet the next disruption that's about to happen. And then the third option is a longer process, but it may be something to be considered, is to try and do an optimization and a migration at the same time. So as you're cleaning up your data and maturing your organization and educating your organization on how to do things better, introducing new functionality, using the same process to start establishing the actual S4HANA roadmap and actually start rolling some of those best practices as you start implementing them into S4HANA and slowly but surely releasing some of that capability to the organization. Okay, so as a wrap up, this has been a fabulous series, and I've hoped that you guys have gotten a lot of benefit out of this. But quite simply, agility is no longer something that is to be desired. It is actually now a requirement to go forward. And at the heart of it, we need foundational components from a system perspective, a data perspective, and a knowledge perspective within our organization. SAP can help us get there, but we need to then start thinking about SAP as an asset and then allowing that asset to start trusting that asset to create the agility that we need to respond to the disruptions. And please, I ask you, I beg of you, please remember the definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. When we go into the S/4HANA phase of our lives, let's really rethink how we go into it, whether we optimize now and implement the new blueprint, or if you have already optimized, but whatever you do, change it, because it's not going to change. Your system's not going to be any better for you unless you've made a fundamental organizational shift in your mindset. And then lastly, to leverage SAP, there's really just 3 steps, right? One, we want to utilize the system, we want to optimize the processes, and we want to maximize the system capabilities and functions in SAP. Okay, that is kind of our series for the year, but I want to tease you with a little bit of next year's topic. So since S/4HANA is obviously been on the forefront of everybody's conversation, and there's a gazillion topics out there around how to implement S/4HANA faster, quicker, error-free, all of the traditional IT-focused goals. Next year's theme for us is we're going to talk a bit about what's the difference between ECC and S/4HANA, what are the opportunities from a business perspective, specifically around supply chain and operations. As a user, as a manager, and as an executive or a leader, what does it mean to my business? When I used to do capacity planning this way, how will I be doing it in S/4HANA, and what can I do? What will it do for me to be even more agile as a supply chain? I used to procure this way. What can it do for me going forward? I used to do my promises to my customers this way in ECC. How am I going to do it now with the new advanced promise? Not technical, but from a business perspective, and hopefully it'll start getting the creative juices going for you guys, and we're starting as early as March 2022 next year. In the meantime, if March 2022 is too far away for you and you are considering looking at ways to improve your business now, we actually offer a couple supply chain boot camps. We have an upcoming one now in December, a virtual one. It's a 3 half-day sessions going through some fundamental topics and teaching you in SAP and allowing you to do some exercises in your own SAP system to see how it will actually improve your business. That's coming up in December. And we're back in person finally, back in February in Arizona, in Scottsdale, Arizona, at a beautiful resort there. And so if you want to have more physical interaction, we will have 3 days on site. There will be more topics to be covered. There's more exercises to do, but you'll have a whole team of Reveal guys around you physically to work through those things with you. And if you need more details, please go to the website. So Kelly, I'd like to hand this over to you and see if there's any questions for me based on this webinar we get.
Thank you, Martin. We actually do have a couple questions for you. I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Go for it.
The first question we have is, we moved to S4 and the change was a lot for the users to accept. Process changes, GUI changes, reporting changes. What do you suggest is the best approach to this?
Yeah, Kelly, that's a good question, because we have seen many companies go to S/4HANA for technical reasons. We've seen people go, our hardware needs to be changed. We need to move to the cloud. Let's just go straight to S/4HANA. Or, you know what, we just want to bite the bullet, move to the cloud as quickly as possible. Maybe it's a cybersecurity challenge, whatever it is. When people move to the S/4HANA state and they haven't really addressed a lot of the things you just mentioned around not educating well on the new GUI, the Fiori tiles that exist, the new processes, people are going to find themselves in a massive change management quandary. Because not only are you changing the system and its capabilities, but you're also now introducing new looks and feel to it, and it's a big challenge. And so when you look at that valley of change, what we must be very careful for is that we don't end up peeling off and not following the new way of doing business, right? So the best way to handle that is to truly assess kind of where the organization is right now in terms of that maturity continuum again, And I would then suggest going immediately into some kind of an educational approach to saying, how do we teach people the whys and the whats behind it? Let's look beyond training. Training is dog jump through hoop kind of stuff. We're talking about educating the team around why and the what these things and how it functions. And so I would strongly recommend that that becomes a program for organizations to think about going forward.
Thanks, Martin. We have another question here. You used the example of MRP Live. We don't even use MRP Classic properly. How do we make this shift to Live?
I mean, that's such a good question, and I appreciate that, because MRP is probably the bane of many people's existence, even now in the ECC world. And like this particular person mentioned, they don't even really use it properly. That's actually very common. MRP Live is something that's going to be a real challenge, right? Because it's thinking in a fairly real-time basis, looking at the net calculations of how stock's moving in and out, and in a fairly real-time basis is giving me a sense of what recommendations to follow. And so if we're not really using MRP Classic right now, which is a daily run, and then you get a whole day to really review all the exceptions and work through it, if we're trying to work on a real-time basis, we have to have some real fundamentals in place. One, we have to make sure that all of our transactional data is real-time. We don't have overdue documents in place. We don't have clutter in the system. Two, that our master data actually reflects reality. Lead times are correct, MRP settings are correct, planning strategies are correct, lot sizing is correct. All of those things are correct so that when those recommendations come forward, we actually can trust it. And then lastly, that we actually understand when SAP is giving me a recommendation, like that example I showed, it's giving me 3 or 4 recommendations of what I can do to deal with that material shortage. I need to know which one's better based on not only my business, but also based on the way SAP is presenting that data to me, right? So there's a lot of why understanding that needs to be put in place behind that. So at the heart of it, again, it comes down to understanding what it means. And so 2 ways to approach that. One is really put some effort into learning how to use MRP Classic properly now. You could also turn S4HANA, MRP Classic on in S4HANA, even though you actually have to actively decide to do that, and then it will look and feel like the ECC world. But if you really want to capitalize on S4HANA's MRP Live, you have to put some fundamentals in place that I mentioned earlier around data, process, and people's knowledge.
Thanks, Martin. Looks like we have one more question. It says, CIOs usually make an easy argument for going to S4, especially since SAP has put a target of 2027 out there. How do we help our other executives like the COOs, CHROs, and so on understand the value S4 can bring to the organization?
Yeah, that is so true, right? I mean, so from a CIO organization perspective, going to S4HANA is a bit of a no-brainer, right? It's one, it's SAP's latest version. 2, SAP's given us a deadline. 3, it can help us move our systems into the cloud and have less dependency on all of these hardware in our own environment. 4, it sets the stage for a lot of the latest technologies around digitizations, machine learning, AI, all of those automations that can occur. So from a CIO perspective, it is truly a no-brainer. The challenge is most organizations on the other side of the fence, the people you just mentioned, COOs, chief supply chain officers, supply chain directors, finance guys, don't always see the value in that because they can barely get the value out of their current system. And so it's a big leap for them to kind of get there, I guess. And my recommendation to this person would be to say is probably go and run the self-assessment again. And I think there's a link on the next page. There we go. Go run the self-assessment because it does a couple things here. One, it's going to establish a true sense of on that continuum for you. It's then going to provide you with like recommendation, like top 3 recommendations. And it's also going to give you like some of your top 3 challenges that you have to work through. it's a great conversational piece for you and those executives on the business side to really talk through what are the things you can prioritize now to get some real benefit out of it, so that they can see the same level of value that the CIO organization is seeing right now. So that would be probably my recommendation, would be to do that. And then, of course, feel free to reach out if you have questions around that. But that's probably the best way, because it creates a conversation within the organization, which is at the heart of where we need to start, right? Let's start looking at it more objectively, and let's see if there's actually, we can see the woods from the trees, right? Let's see if we can actually see the value that this can bring for us.
Thank you, Martin. And it looks like that is all the questions that we have for you today.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. It's been a pleasure doing this. I've always enjoyed these webinars.
And speaking of, this webinar is going to be available later on our website under our Insights tab. And then you'll also find our other insights and our previously recorded webinars there, as well as educational content such as our white papers, blogs, and some helpful publications. So we will get that webinar for next year, that information out to you soon. And that's all for today. So thank you for joining us again, and enjoy the upcoming holidays.
Thank you, Kelly. Much appreciated. Good seeing everybody. Bye-bye.